CRI. I am pleased to be moderating today's session, the first roundtable actually, which basically marks the end of a great series of events that the Beirut Urban Lab at AUB, Habitat for Humanity, the NRC, and UN Habitat have organized over this past month on housing uncertainties, financial crises, and social protection. I will be moderating the first roundtable, whereas my colleague Samar Farhat from Habitat for Humanity will be moderating the second. Basically, both roundtables speak about social protection and housing in the Arab region. The first will be gathering, or in the first session, we'll be basically listening from scholars and from experts about their views, their insights, and their perceptions vis-a-vis the housing crisis, and social protection schemes, whereas in the second we'll be listening more from practitioners and policymakers. And this session about social protection and housing comes basically after three panel sessions that had already taken place. The first one was entitled "The Contours of Housing Financialization." The second was on housing loans and mortgages. And the third was on urban precarious shelters, and it started tapping into the different vulnerabilities and the intersectionalities between different vulnerable groups and how they're most impacted by the cost of living crises and by housing or shelter crises more broadly. So it was such a prelude to our discussion today about social policy vis-a-vis housing. So basically, today's roundtable will mostly help us understand how can our social protection schemes in the different Arab contexts that we come from respond, if at all, to the increasing dire living conditions of today's urban majority. We live in the Arab region that is full of conflicts, full of crises. We had the COVID-19 pandemic, which had very severe repercussions on the Arab region, social repercussions or socioeconomic repercussions. In Lebanon, we had the Beirut blast. The war in Ukraine came to exacerbate the socioeconomic repercussions of the COVID-19 crisis. In Egypt, we're living currently in the middle of a financial crisis that resembles what happened in Lebanon or what started in Lebanon in the early 2019. Tunisia is following suit. Sudan is in the middle of a conflict. And amid all of this, we see that the financialization of shelter has actually created major tensions between the value of an apartment as a home and its role as a financial asset. And this was accompanied by the penetration of financial markets into the housing sector with public incentives, and therefore the right to shelter was reduced to a minimum. It was reduced to market enablement. At the same time, social protection schemes have been very anemic, very frail, very fragmented, not universal, not inclusive, not effective, and not sustainable. So they were, on the other hand, unable to protect the people by providing them so many access to so many life necessities, among which one that is key, that is very important, which is housing. So this is in a nutshell. Without further ado, because we have very distinguished speakers with us today, so I don't want to take a lot of time. I would like to start off by introducing the speakers and then kickstarting basically the discussion. Our first speaker is Dr. Rana Jawad. She's a reader in social policy at the University of Bath. She specializes in the social policies and welfare systems in the Middle East and North Africa region, and she has published widely on the topic in a range of academic and international reports. She's the co-founder and co-convener of the MENA Social Policy Network. Our second speaker is Dr. Hania Shulqami, who's an associate research professor at the Social Research Center at the American University in Cairo. She's an Egyptian anthropologist whose work focuses on gender, health, and social protection in Egypt. She has served as a special advisor to the Minister of Social Solidarity and was the regional coordinator of the Pathways to Women's Empowerment Research Consortium in partnership with the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, in the UK. She's currently a member of the UNESCO Management of Social Transformations Committee, 2019 till 2022, and she has been a research associate at the International Population Council and was the Loma Evans Pitcher Junior Research Fellow at St. Anne's College at Oxford University. Our third speaker is Dr. Zina Nermi, who's an Associate Professor of Public Policy at UNU Merit at Maastricht University. She has over 2 decades of professional and academic experience in the area of public policy, social policy, public sector reform, and governance. She has a PhD in public policy and policy analysis that was funded by and she was funded during her studies by Marie Curie. She holds a bachelor's degree in finance from Xavier University in Ohio and a master's degree in labor and human resources from the Ohio State University. Her areas of expertise are public policy, social protection policy and financing, social cohesion, and governance. Our last, and this is not in chronological order, basically. I'm saying first, last, and second, just to help pace myself. Basically, our fourth speaker is Mr. Sami Zgheib, who's an economist and research manager at the Policy Initiative. He has led multiple research and policy advocacy projects on Lebanon's political economy, governance structures, macroeconomics, local economic development, and social protection. His work has been published in academic and policy publications across local and international platforms. Sami holds a master's in public policy from the University of Reading in the United Kingdom and a BA in economics from the American University of Beirut. So let's start with the first round of questions. Maybe I can start off by asking Dr. Rana Jawad, if you don't mind. So just so we can get the full picture about social protection schemes and start slowly delving deeper into the analysis of that intersection between social protection and housing, which is rarely addressed. How have social protection schemes evolved in the region? Who has championed them? And what life necessities have they taken into account? And of course, in that last part of the question, we're very interested to know if there has been any consideration or any significant consideration to housing in Arab social protection schemes. Dr. Jawad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Farah. And I know I have 3 minutes to answer this question, so I'll keep to that. I think it's important to clarify the difference between social protection and social policy, particularly if we are referring to housing as well. And social protection, there are different opinions, but I would support an understanding of social protection that's specific to income loss and income maintenance. So in some ways, we could say that it might be a bit of a stretch to connect social protection to housing, unless we are thinking in the particular sense of social safety nets and vulnerable and poor households that are targeted by social assistance programs, particularly in the form, for example, of cash transfers that might be connected to other social or health-related conditions. So I think first it would be helpful just to think about housing as a social right and as part of a wider social policy system, and then we begin to differentiate. I mean, this is a conversation for another time. I think we should also recognize that the MENA region, Arab countries, have always had social assistance and social security schemes of one form or another. These have been state-funded and have undergone many different reforms and expansions, particularly since the mid-2010s. As you said, Farah, we know that there is incomplete coverage, inadequate benefits, there is fragmentation, often duplication, and as well that's as much of a problem. We always talk about lack of coverage, but also there is duplication of services. So ministries of health and social solidarity very often might provide similar kinds of schemes, so there is that issue as well. So it's a lot to fit into a few minutes. I think suffice to say that there's been a major expansion and reform of social assistance programs since the mid-2010s. We know that often MENA governments are reactive and they think of social policy and social protection programs as something for vulnerable groups and therefore something that should be targeted, and particularly at this point in time, with the support of international organizations. So the champions of this work, if you like, depending on countries, would be the World Bank, UNICEF, ILO, to a certain extent WFP, and they operate mostly in some of the countries that are perhaps better affiliated to them, like Jordan and Egypt. But we mustn't forget that there are other international actors like China and South Korea that are very active in other countries in the region, like, for example, like Algeria, and they too provide housing support. And so because of these actors, there's a lot of emphasis on targeting, on developing data sets, because the region lacks the data. Yeah, so in order to reach to have correct reach with these programs, we need to know who are the eligible populations. Now, the needs that have been prioritized can sort of roughly be put under the umbrella of human capital. And if you think about income and employment, yeah, those are that's the real focus of a lot of these social protection programs. And it's under the general umbrella of investing in people through nutrition, so food security, access to food, healthcare could be one of the conditions, quality of education, and jobs and skills. And these are the types of needs that we see in the most prominent programs and that are actually, you know, doing a good job. Yeah, I think it's easy to criticize, but there are vulnerable populations that are being reached. I'm sure my colleagues will know more, but if we talk a lot about the programs in Egypt, the Takaful and Karama programs, these are reaching a very large proportion of female-headed households. And now with a new program called Fursa, they're also developing the idea of gender empowerment and thinking about economic independence. Yeah, of course, these are programs that, again, we can continue to say that they are not reaching enough households, but there is an attempt to do this. But the needs are very much income and employment. Now, there is a development in some countries, which is the access to social housing. I mean, again, in Egypt, but also in Jordan and in Algeria. Yeah, so there are countries where affordable social housing is a government program. And the existing databases that are being used to target vulnerable households for the social assistance programs and the social protection programs are beginning to be used in some cases to support access to affordable housing. But this is very much about ownership of housing. Yeah, so we still have the logic of owning a house as an asset and bringing in the private banks and the private sector to facilitate this, albeit with potentially subsidized rates of interest. But a key element of this, of the access to housing in particular, that's championed by the World Bank and the Western donor countries, we could say, is women's empowerment and the disparity between the ownership of housing between men and women in the MENA region, yeah, for a range of laws. So these processes exist. Housing doesn't necessarily exist under the social protection umbrella, because it is about owning a house eventually, and it is an asset. Although in cases where there is a focus on gender empowerment, there seems to be a stronger connection with economic and financial independence. I'm sure there's more that can be said, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those insights. Let's continue with Dr. Shulqami, Dr. Hania Shulqami. So do you agree that housing is absent from or rarely accounted for in the Arab region social protection schemes? And if we can now get to the why is it so? Why are they absent or rarely accounted for?
Good afternoon, everyone. وكل سنة وانتم طيبين. النهاردة وقفة عرفات. I wish everyone a happy Eid, and I completely disagree, of course, because housing was at the heart of the social contract and the social protection contract of the 1950s. We had subsidized council housing from in Ain Sira, and at least in Egypt and actually in Algeria and other Arab countries, we had subsidized council housing. We had rent controls for the middle class, and we had worker housing on site in industries, in the big factories and plants outside the cities. And as Dr. Rana said, this is all about income loss and income maintenance, because this was to address the consumption and expenditure needs of a working class and an emerging middle class and lower middle class. So in fact, housing and shelter were at the heart of this obligation and commitment to social protection and to empowerment through asset transfer and through subsidized rents. Of course, asset transfers of land for rural dwellers. But since the liberalization of land and labor markets, economically vulnerable groups in all Arab countries, in fact, have been left at the mercy of a huge, vibrant, private build domain. So the low-income housing that was being built was a store of capital, and people put their savings into this, whether also in rural or urban areas. We know from for example, in the case of Egypt that I'm more familiar with, the Household Income Expenditure Survey, the majority of people who are poor enough to qualify for cash transfers and for benefits live in their own property. So ownership is not, ownership is not a sign of wealth. It's actually a proxy for a certain level of vulnerability. But the problem there is that when, of course, the publicly provided housing also in the urban Arab world has tended to favor the lower middle class. And it favors the lower middle class. So here, even as Rana mentioned, the subsidized social housing in Egypt, it relies on people having a steady income and proof of income that makes them creditworthy. So it's very difficult for people who have irregular income to access this subsidized housing. The real and important shift that took place here in Egypt 7 years ago was to accept the idea of subsidized rental rather than subsidized ownership or mortgages. And I think this is a good way to go. The stock is just not enough. And leaving people at the mercy of the informal, privately owned housing market leaves them vulnerable to other forms of state interventions that are conflicting with this. So whether formalization of land tenure, most people don't have a title to the land upon which they built. Zoning predicaments are a nightmare anywhere. Of course, utilities and the pricing of utilities, and also the sort of legalization of access to utilities. So I disagree that it was absent. I think it was very present, but it has deteriorated, like a lot of the social protection and social policy provisions have deteriorated. And I don't think we've come to a new understanding of how to provide housing and shelter given these factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the succinct answer. And I think everybody agrees with you that, most recently, housing has been just provided following this deterioration as part of the minimum social security guarantees, instead of being like an integral or a fundamental part of broader, well-integrated social protection schemes or social policy at large. Now, Dr. Zina Nami, what mechanisms of housing and social protection financialization are seen in the Arab region, and how integrated are they, and how solid are they?
Yeah, thank you also for this invitation, and happy Eid, everybody. I wish you you're celebrating a very nice time. Maybe I will pick it up from what Tanya was saying, and actually combining that there is a gap in that issue as well, and that is something we have inherited recently over the deterioration of what has happened. I think if we're talking about mechanisms, particularly of housing and social protection, they're very different, and I think it's very important classify which countries are we talking about. If we're talking about Gulf countries, if we're talking about North African countries, if we're talking about the poor, non-oil, the trajectory has been very different. But with that said, and I think going back to 2 points also Rana had mentioned and Hani, and trying to combine them if I'm able to do so. Social protection in its abstract form, how we understand it, and here I'm taking maybe the ILO definition, does not necessarily include housing as part and parcel of it. However, I think what we see, what is going on in this deterioration, as I see it, and with the financialization, is that social protection systems have reached a perceived inadequate level, an unreliable level in the Arab countries, in most of the Arab countries, that actually individuals have lost faith in the ability of these systems to be able to pick them up when they are vulnerable, for the most part. And then there's this lack of trust in the system that is cross-cutting for all groups. And here comes the issue of housing and the financialization of housing, which I think that is where your question is. And with the absence of social systems, that I am sure that if I'm vulnerable, where social protection is supposed to protect me at the points in time where I'm not able to take care of myself, housing becomes actually my social protection. It becomes my mechanism to make sure I don't fall into poverty. And this is for the people that are able to do that. So whether it's through real estate investment, speculation, I think what those of you in the housing world call as the flipping, housing as an asset, that is a part that we need to think about, that housing takes place of what social protection is supposed to do. So me as a citizen, I know that the government will never take care of me at my vulnerable points. I don't have trust in government, the system has failed, then I'm going to invest that. And that's going to start driving the prices. And, it depends who is able to. And then we come to the part who is left behind. Now, connecting social protection to housing. And I think the interesting part, and at least with the part of work where we have been doing, actually, it becomes a proxy. And now we're going to the people that are poor or vulnerable. It becomes a proxy of deprivation. And you link it back to how you classify people as deprived, and hence they fall into these categories that you eventually want to provide them with the social assistance part of social protection. And you see that a lot of measurements now that are being sort of called for by a lot of different organizations include now what we call multidimensional poverty. So what happens in a lot of situations, for example, or in a lot of governments, that you start to calculate poverty based on a multidimensional sense, and then housing, whether it's through overcrowding, whether it is through wash level, whatever it is, then these families are considered, and then they are eligible to some sort of social protection benefits. And these are two different stories. The first story that I said about the financialization, and the second story about how does it link to social protection. And through it all, it does become a policy issue. How is it being handled? The situation that Tanya was referring to, that things were not, they were part of an implicit social contract. Things changed in the 70s. There was a lot of rural to urban migration. And then we forget the privatization and the structural adjustment programs of the 90s. But what is very interesting, and that I will close with that, is that actually these situations are not new globally. I mean, I think we have a lot of examples. And actually in old Europe, or Europe of the 1800s or the 1900s, Victorian England, for example, when it comes to housing and social protection. And there are solutions of how to integrate that together. But then we come back to the same question: is there a political will? How are we going to do that? And I think we will talk about that later in the other questions, is that how can it be a grassroots movement to push for that solution? So I will stop here.
Thanks a lot. And I think we have started to unpack the key tension points in the discussion, and we'll get more into the details of that. But thank you, the three of you, for those illuminations already. Sami, your turn. So basically, let's talk about the political economy. We know that in the Arab region, everything has got political economic factors that governs it. So what is the political economy basically that is behind the dearth of social protection and the poor or no consideration to housing needs after the deterioration that the three previous speakers have basically highlighted. What are the governance issues that are driving this?
Yeah, thank you. And hello, everyone. And thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me fine. Basically, I think that the issue that we started talking about, the issue of the social contract, and I think there has been a fundamental change in the way social contracts are being conceived, particularly during the after 1970s and with the rise of the global neoliberal order. There has been a very clear removal of the state as a social agent, and this is something that not only happened here in the Arab world, but also happened at the global level. And this is something that this marquee event we see have changed the way we approach social protection in the first place. And I think one of the fundamental questions that we have to ask is that, do we consider housing to be a right? Because if we do, then in some doctrines of for the understanding of social protection or social policy more broadly is basically a maintenance of people's socioeconomic rights, right? And if we do consider housing to be a socioeconomic right, then it is the role of social protection to maintain this right and to make sure that people can actually get it and achieve it through different mediums, policy choices, etc. However, I think that social protection in the Arab region, and I know this for sure to be the case in Lebanon, is not necessarily a system of rights, right? It's a system of privilege. We have built systems that reward people with social privileges based on the relative political significance that they bring forth. If you one clear example of this would be if you look at the pension system in Lebanon, for example, which is a very clear indication of when and how this happened, in which, if you are an army general or a judge, you are getting very generous pension benefits versus if you all work in informal sector, you basically get nothing, right? So there have been these systems in place, social systems, social insurance systems that have been not only exclusionary and fragmented, etc., which are definitely system design failures, but have been conceived not necessarily based on a conception of social protection that guarantees rights-based approach to social protection, rather a privilege-based approach. And I think certainly this is not the case all across the Arab region. This is fundamentally different based on the different regimes that we are talking about. But I really think this is where the crux of the issue is. How does housing fit within the social contract that we want to build? How does housing, what kind of role do we want housing to play in society moving forward and in the economy? And all of these questions are very big questions that have to be answered, not only in individual countries, but also on the global level.
Thanks, Sami. I think we can stay with you to, so we've covered the political economic perspective. Now, if we can go to the macroeconomic perspective a little bit more, and if we can have you answer that question, which is regarding the economic factors and the public policies, I mean, more generally, including some legal frameworks that might be driving up the cost of shelter in the Arab region, and how Arab social protection schemes might be or not adjusting to fluctuations, to the resulting actually fluctuations in the cost of living and therefore in the cost of shelter.
Yeah, I think that housing policy indeed is not only something that you could handle through social protection or you could handle through social policy. This is fundamentally like a macroeconomic question. Again, as you said, it's the fundamental question is what kind of role do I want real estate property to play in my macroeconomic model, right? I think this has fundamentally also changed in the Arab region, but also globally. And these are, have very well been pointed out. The role of financialization, the role of the diminishing role of the state in regulations of real estate markets, and the growing role of private sector, which fundamentally is a profit-seeking, rent-seeking sector. These dynamics have been seen very much in the Arab region, but more importantly, I think the Arab region has been one of the most highly or most the acceleration of urbanization that we have seen in the Arab region over the past 50 years has been certainly one of the biggest and most and fastest in the world. We have seen an urbanization rate of around 60% today in the Arab region. This urbanization has increased by 400% compared to the 1970s, which is, so this naturally created higher levels of demand for properties in cities. Couple this with a deregulation of real estate markets, a removal of the state as a regulator, as a market maker in this very important market, and you have the opportunities for financialization, opportunities for rent extraction, not only for normal private sectors, because again we have private sectors that are very much intertwined with the political regimes that we have. So we have private sectors that not necessarily behave based on normal, good old liberal capitalist rules of markets. Rather, we have fundamental distortions in our sectors. So this does create a system where housing is the principal worry that exists on any young person's mind across the Arab region. And leads to extreme cases like we see in Lebanon today, where access to housing can only happen through you don't have mortgages in Lebanon, neither private nor public mortgages. You still have like very old rent control that has not yet been reformed, but somehow is being reformed. But you have a system where your access to housing as a young person in Lebanon today is impossible, right? Unless you are a millionaire, you can literally not buy a house. And I think this is what post-neoliberal housing markets would look like, right? And I think this would be the case across the region if things continue to be as they are.
Yes, and on top of all of the factors that you've mentioned, I may add gentrification, which also reflects, the system and the whole model that we've been operating or that we've been living in. Now, I'd like us to move to Dr. Hania Shulqami again. So basically, I have a specific question for you, and it happens luckily by answering it, you'd be also answering this critical or tension point that came up, which I think is very interesting. So we were speaking about social policy versus social protection. Is housing or housing needs, are they included in social policy or versus in social protection? Like, are they included in one but not the other? And if they were included initially, but with the deterioration and with the time, or by the time social protection has become just about, as I said before, minimum income security guarantees, then we could consider them included, but inadequately so. So this is one of the tension points that I'd like you to respond to. And here comes the specific question, which is in line of all of this. So basically, can mortgage and rent be considered temporary insecurity, whereas home ownership considered long-term protection in countries where we've got those recurrent cycles of hyperinflation continuously threatening the safety of people, especially the poor and low middle income classes? And by responding to that, if you can tell us, what is social security vis-a-vis shelter? How do you define it?
I will attempt. Okay, so let me try. I would argue that housing policy is a social policy. Income support for shelter is a social protection policy. So all of the policies and interventions that enable people to find shelter, mostly through income support, whether it's subsidized mortgage rates or subsidized council housing, or all of these things that enable, or social housing that enable people to afford shelter, are a social protection intervention. Housing policy, where you build it and who gets it and how you price it and so on, is a social policy. Now, I think, and I may be wrong, and again, I apologize, I haven't attended any of the activities of the lab before, but to my limited understanding, I think the problem is with this concept of ownership. So social housing is rental. I mean, you know, and Europe, when it moved from rental to mortgage, to enabling people to buy their own homes as if this is security, created a problem, precipitated a problem for a simple reason, is that when you move from a dynamic and available rental option, which you can subsidize through helping people to afford rents, when you move into house ownership, you're creating a sclerotic housing market, because people have different needs. They have dynamic needs. Now, it's fine if these homes are an asset that you can securitize or remortgage or somehow financialize. But there are three problems with that. One is that these assets are often very low quality assets, and you know, the scarcity is a scarcity amongst a group of equally poor people. Secondly, that the financialization, whether remortgaging or using it as an asset, if unregulated, leads to other vulnerabilities. So if we look at the Egypt's experience of financialization now, is really a time bomb, because people are paying very high interest rates. There is very poor supervision concerning the lenders, and people are at unnecessary risk because they're over leveraged, because we don't have the equivalent of an I-score or some kind of regulation that enables people to know their leverage ceiling or benchmark. So I think the problem is with ownership. Ownership also is gender blind, and it ignores the dynamics within the family of who owns this asset and who controls it, and if this is, it's not welfare that is equally distributed within the family, and maybe it's an asset that works when housing markets are healthy, but doesn't work when if they're over leveraged. And I think that this means that we need to de-incentivize developers from creating housing scarcity by enabling a vibrant rental market, but one that is also supervised. And that's my last point, is that supervision doesn't just mean in terms of rent controls, which really have been the major problem that have de-incentivized developers from building. But supervision is also about quality, and the quality of the urban ecology that people are living in. When these properties are unregulated, when landlords are unfair, when they're not law-abiding, when these are homes that are unfit to live in, that creates another burden. So I hope I've answered your question to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Very much so, and things are getting clearer and clearer now. So thanks so much for that. Dr. Jawad, so here if we can, so Dr. Nami started to mention, when she was talking about financialization, she started to mention targeting as being one of the key traits of housing financialization. So along these lines, in thinking about targeting the poor and targeting the most vulnerable, are mortgage holders and renters considered? And how might concerns about targeting the most destitute, the most vulnerable, typically mean that the increasingly indebted and impoverished middle class are unable to benefit from support? So here we could also speak about the missing middle.
Yeah, thank you, Farah. That's right. Yeah, thank you. And I think we've probably already begun to touch on some of these issues. Yeah, so I mean, there's a long-standing debate about the benefits of targeting. And it's an ideological debate as well, yeah, and depending on where you stand, there will be different arguments for and against the administrative costs and the effectiveness of targeting, yeah. And I mean, we know there is evidence from across the world that universal programs, universal coverage is much more likely to reduce poverty and inequality. And this is evidence from across the world. This doesn't mean that targeting doesn't have a place in social policy systems, particularly in relation to those who are extremely poor. However, it's important to balance them. Now, the issue with so I think that the jury's out, I think, in terms of targeting, but I think it's fair to say that what we are currently seeing in the MENA region is great support for targeting. It is seen as a way of becoming more efficient with state programs and state expenditure. And unfortunately, efficiency is now seen as a form of effectiveness as well, I think, by ministries of social solidarity. And I think, again, this is promoted by the big international institutions, and that's where all the data registries are coming from, and the social registries, which in themselves are good, but again, it's about putting this into perspective. So I think the issue with housing, as we've been saying, it's the quality, it's the affordability. These are fundamental aspects of human well-being and human welfare. There is a lot of pressure on housing in the MENA countries due to growing populations and demand for housing. And of course, there's a refugee influx, and we continue to have urban-rural migration as well. So there's a lot of pressure, and there is a need for a better regulated, affordable housing. Now, as far as I know, all the poverty targeting programs, apart from some of the few that I've already mentioned in Egypt and Jordan, they don't include mortgage holders, because housing is seen as an asset. So typically when an assessment of the income and the situation of a household is done, and usually this is done through proxy measures, owning a house is one of the factors that might exclude a household from benefiting. So that's as far as I know from these programs. So renters, for example, may be included, and we do have examples of these from the region, Egypt and Jordan and the North African countries, particularly where there is low income within the household. And by this, we could be referring to policemen or teachers. So they might be renters, but they may be eligible for some of this subsidized support that could be targeted, which is housing oriented, but they are considered low income. And I think this takes us to the question of what is the middle class in the MENA region. I think this is still, it's not a theoretical question, because it's important to identify who the middle classes are. And again, there are perspectives on this. Is it about what they consume, or is it about other social demographic factors, for example, the level of education? And this in itself, I think, puts these groups of people in a difficult situation, because many of them are vulnerable, if you like, or vulnerable to poverty. And I think there's been some good data produced by the UNESCO on the very large proportion of vulnerable populations who are who would not be able to withstand a crisis. So they may be middle class in that they have higher incomes or higher levels of consumption, but they haven't got savings and they haven't got the assets and the support to fall back on. And of course, this is what we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic. So because of the level of income that they have, and because they are not clearly identified, they are missed by the existing targeted systems that we have. And I think in that sense, this is one of the arguments why there needs to be some overhaul and a more universal approach in some way to be able to reach these wider population groups. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Dr. Naemi, I'm conscious of time, so that's why you might feel that I'm going a bit faster, but I want us to cover pretty much all the dimensions that we had planned to discuss. So Dr. Naemi, we cannot hear enough from you regarding how prevalent financial strategies are undermining access to housing in the Arab region. So if you can further elaborate, I know you didn't get enough time last time when you first intervened. And if you could more specifically talk about microfinance, how how the existing or the new models of housing microfinance are providing pathways for taking renters and mortgage holders into consideration if they are at risk of losing houses. And indebtedness is real in our region, and it's getting intergenerational. So the floor is yours, and we're all ears.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, as I'm listening, I want to really thank you all again for this opportunity to bring this topic and to talk about it. I think it is very critical, and just maybe if you allow me just a minute to say that I think the bringing social protection and housing into the same discussion, while we could sit and argue until tomorrow what the definitions are, they're both at the end. I think we all agree, and we are all here that they are, whether it's housing or social protection, they are a fundamental right. And I think if we're starting from that point, then it's the details. And I think I just want to go back to the point where if you discuss the macroeconomic, and I want to highlight the privatization, structural adjustment. Of course, it's different with different countries, as I said in the Middle East. But the liberal agenda has taken over, not just in the Middle East, but in a lot of other countries, and with goods and bads, but in particular as it relates to housing. Sami was mentioning about the prices of houses, and I just peeked a little bit to see if I would want to buy a small apartment in Beirut today. It would cost me more than I would want to buy an apartment in Amsterdam. So it makes you wonder, but also those of, who, if you've studied finance and business, you know that if it's offered by this price, there might be somebody who is willing to pay that. So the solution has to be creative, and microfinancing is one of the ways that can solve it. I think we have a lot of examples, and there are many different strategies that actually have to be, to sort of counter what is going on, because I do think we know the problems. So this high cost that we are talking about, something's got to give. And I think we've mentioned the middle class, which is dwindling, as we know, in our region. And for many of the middle class, I think the issue of the housing is what keeps them in the middle class. If they lose also that element, this is one big group also into poverty. So microfinancing is a solution, but it is also one solution that we know of. And the question then becomes is that how can we think about other solutions? So even I think in Lebanon, in Egypt, I'm familiar, and I think Anya would know more, like you also have the Tanmiya micro enterprises. In Palestine, you have the microfund for women also. And even, for example, in Jordan, even the National Aid Fund has this component of the housing that is into social protection. So microfinancing and these strategies are there. But actually what I think is very important, and that's where I would actually push this group together with other groups that are interested and concerned about fundamental rights of societies and social justice. It's to start to think about different mechanisms that are a bit creative and out of the box. And here I know there's a lot of discussions on that, and we can talk about this later, but it's also, how can we start to think about actually innovative social financing? And I will stop it here. Maybe we go back to this, but I think microfunding is there. There's a lot of examples on why it works. We've done a lot of studies on it, but I do think we're also still up against the wall. And I do think we need to think of a different way to so I will stop here. I'm happy to comment on that further, but I will come back to that if there's
I'm sure you get the chance to do so. Well, I was a bit biased when posing the question, but you still insisted on your, but I'm convinced, because it's a deadlock. Thinking about Arab contexts, and especially the Lebanese, if we're going to take it as an example, as you did. So basically, let's now look at things from a more forward-looking perspective. Let's talk policy recommendations. Let's start with Dr. Hania Shulkami and basically discuss what are the opportunities and prospects for improvement in Arab social protection schemes and their effectiveness, inclusiveness, sustainability, adequacy, and for a more systematic and more sufficient inclusion of housing coverage in these schemes.
Okay, I will be very succinct. I think that the schemes that Zina has mentioned are lower middle class. And what Rana mentioned, these are lower middle class. These are not for poor people. I mean, they're all connected to a kind of focus on income. And even when we use proxies of consumption for targeting and so on. So I would recommend for effectiveness and for the future, and again, I may be wrong, 3 shifts. A shift from focusing on income to acknowledging consumption and expenditure by looking at how much people should be spending on housing, looking at the costs of rentals, looking at mortgages. So the whole Arab world has shifted away from subsidized consumption because of, I mean, some valid points. I mean, they may be neoliberal, but they are valid about, what should you be subsidizing. But housing is a beneficial expenditure. So maybe you shouldn't be subsidizing sugar and tobacco and gas, but so looking at how much housing people consume and trying to support that. Another shift is really to overcome this obsession with the individual and the household, and looking at the well-being and of communities, and the value, the importance of shared spaces, of the quality of utilities, of home repairs and collectivities, because I don't think that we'll be able to resolve any of these problems by focusing on individual households and families. So I think from private welfare to the common good, I think is an important and underappreciated scheme, at least in the Arab world, but we see other parts of the world where what you lack in terms of your private space, there are community-based interventions that, whether spaces for children to play or study, or common bathrooms and showers, or collective areas, we've just ditched this whole notion of community. And also from social protection, in terms of income support, which is a very narrow focus, to looking at services, transport, school vouchers, daycare, health and disability, and trying to think of social protection as a set of interventions that, and of course, all of these things are, you look at different countries and, there are school vouchers, there are daycare vouchers here and there, but I think it's a shift in our thinking about how to protect and support people, whether free Wi-Fi, as they're doing in parts of India. I mean, these things I think are ripe for consideration. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Dr. Rana Jawad, what are the specific tools and mechanisms that should be devised and deployed to make such improvements possible in the region? So the tangible solutions that we need to definitely hear from you. For the middle classes or for everyone in terms of social? Let's say for everyone, and if you can disaggregate, or if they are disaggregatable, then why not? So the circumstances will vary, yeah, and I think there are different fault lines by which populations are usually divided for the sake of government social protection schemes, depending on what those are. And I'm afraid the division between social assistance, social safety nets, and employment-based social insurance and social security still holds across the world. And I mean, we talk about the financialization, neoliberalism, and the cost of housing, the inaccessibility of housing. This is happening across the world, yeah, at the moment anyway. And the cost, and I think the cost of housing, and access to it is an issue that isn't just in the MENA region, although it's at different scales. So I think that where there are low-income households that are not in work or have dependents and they are not able to work, they need shelter. They have a right to social shelter, and as they are receiving social assistance, which could be in the form of cash transfers from the state, they should have access to housing. At the moment, these
population groups and these households, they are often female-headed households, elderly people, families with disabilities in the Arab countries, yeah? At the moment, they might be living in informal housing, in housing that they may have just borrowed literally from a family member, or they perhaps may have had some informal support. Of course, in the case of children, in extreme cases, they go into institutional care. And this is a massive problem in countries like Lebanon in particular, where the issue is one of poverty, where the family is unable to look after the child. However, because of this issue, the child goes into institutional care. So housing and shelter is provided that way. And I think that this is the big question about how states can therefore provide this more of this kind of housing. I mean, Dr. Hania referred to the social housing that existed in the post-independence era, which has disappeared. But this is important. Otherwise, we have the slums, the informal settlements, and there's a lot that has already that we know how households and poor populations cope negatively in many ways because of these, I mean, we used to call them the urban poverty belts and such. I think for those in employment, and this is difficult because being in employment doesn't mean that one is earning enough and able to meet their needs, yeah, particularly with economic crises and inflation issues. I think these are again macroeconomic questions that do have to, that may well require foreign aid and grants unless countries are able to put their budgets in order, and you know, economic growth is not going to happen overnight, but there could be, and my colleagues who are the financial experts could say more, and the economists in the room, there are certainly reforms in governance and government budgets that may well release funds, but all Arab countries in particular at the moment are facing huge deficits and huge debt repayment commitments. So I think the question of what we do with the category of the population that is in work may well be having 2 to 3 jobs, may well be in informal employment. The rights of these, I think, is a trickier one, because this has to do with the capacity to rent or to buy. If they are renting, then there needs to be adequate regulation of rents and access to adequate housing that way. So regulation is important. But the question of actually being able to buy a property and own a house, I think is very much the $1 million question. And I don't think many countries have resolved this yet. To resolve it, the government needs to mobilize its own assets and resources to be able to support the population. And these are very difficult questions for a lot of the countries that we're looking at, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zina Narmi. So now, beyond microfinance, if we can speak about how can housing be included in a broader system of effective financing for universal social protection in the Arab region.
So maybe if one thing we can all agree on is that social protection and housing are mutually supportive. I think that we've talked about, and some of you might have been in these sessions when we talked about universal social protection funds. I think to get out of this bottleneck, we cannot exclude the private sector. So that's number one in terms of like a comprehensive financing. So, housing has to be included in a broader system of financing and universal, also social protection financing. But to be able to do that, you need the private sector. You're not going to be able to do this just on a government perspective. You also need the international community, but which you know, we're over time now, and I can speak for hours about the contribution of the international community, how not always it's actually contributing positively, not ill-intentioned, but sometimes it's also very conflicting. And then, of course, there are 2 points. I will come back to that very quickly. But everything, I think, still has to theoretically be controlled by the government, who is also the duty bearer at the end and who supposedly is the legitimate driver of this. Whether it's, as we said, starting from housing as a fundamental right, integrating it in the planning, but also what Rana also mentioned that and touched on this when we talk about legal and regulatory frameworks. I mean, all of these have to sort of all be bundled together. And there are 2 points where I think, but again, I'm not the expert in the housing issue, where I think we need to start to think of maybe when we talk about this private-public partnership. Housing trust funds that are transparent. I know that, you know, even, for example, in the case of Egypt, we see this a lot in many Arab countries. Trust funds are a huge thing. Of course, they're always black boxes and we don't know what we're operating, but I am sure these trust funds are very able, from a financing perspective, to innovatively start solving the solution. How we would do that, I don't know. Like I said, it's a creative solution, but it's not that the money is not there. The money is there, but it's where and how legally that money is being used and how is it being used. The other thing we talked about a lot, and this is very theoretical, but there's also this idea of the social impact bonds, right? Which at the end of the day, if you think about it, people who are wealthy also want to invest. And investing in housing and improving the well-being of the whole society is actually a very profitable business. And that is something I still cannot get my mind on, is that keeping people in poverty is actually not a smart business decision. So definitely there is a lot of, and I mean, I have to use the Arabic word here because I don't find an English equivalent that is as good. Is like التخبط اللانهائي in the siyasat. It is what it is. It's kind of like you have this atom and it's just going everywhere. And sometimes I'm like, if they want it to be that bad, it cannot be that bad. So I think innovative financing models, they are there. And I think, again, going back, maybe I'll close with our host today, with the Beirut Urban Lab. And when I was reading about it and what it was doing, these initiatives are going to be sort of the drivers, because at the end of the day, it is what knows what is on the ground, but it's mobilizing this mechanism of financing, which is a very political decision. But if you find a way to convince policymakers, and that is, that's the $1 million question, that is actually better for the long term to do that, because we have examples of this historically in Europe, then I think everybody wins. But how do we do that? Again, that's, I think, for another long discussion, but I will stop it here.
Thanks a lot. Sami, if you can end with a word on the governance and social and policy reforms that you think are a must to ensure that housing becomes accessible and affordable to all. Just a last word, please.
Yes, that would be very quick. And since I'm not really a housing expert, so I cannot really offer much in the technical way. But I think, and what Dr. Zina was saying now, along with all the other doctors in these remarks, I think, we have an agreement that housing is not only just simply a right; it's a foundational right of other kinds of rights. You cannot have a right for healthcare, a right for education, a right for anything without having the right of shelter first. So I think in that way, that also makes housing a sort of prerequisite of any kind of development model that one needs to choose. So it's not only paying off on the social level, it also pays off on the economic level, and that makes it a very important sector in which the state itself can play a very entrepreneurial role. And here I agree that making the state a market shaper in the real estate market through creating fiscal, monetary, etc. tools that it can use in order to broker partnerships with civil society, with the private sector, in order to reach a goal of in which housing is actually awarded to all, and housing can actually play the fundamental role in the development model, is the only way to go. Now, how can we get there is a whole other question, and I'm not really sure how technically we can get here. But I mean, it goes beyond the point of this.
Thanks so much, Sami. I know we went past the time. I'm very sorry. I'm a bad moderator, obviously. So I think we're gonna have to borrow a couple of more minutes from the next roundtable just to see if the audience has, if someone in the audience has a question, a burning question. Maybe you could take just 2 questions, and we can close on this note. Who would like to come in from the audience? Otherwise, we could definitely end now, and this way the speakers and the moderator of the next session won't be upset. Any burning questions? Now, Dr. Jawad has to leave us, but if nobody, thank you, Dr. Jawad, thank you very much. So if nobody has a question that they want to come in and speak out, maybe they could just type their questions in the chat, and the speakers could probably also respond in the chat. Yes, so thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to the organizer for the invitation, for allowing me to moderate. Thank you to all 4 speakers for their illuminating thoughts, for the enlightening presentations that they had. I'm gonna hand it over now to Suha and our next moderator, Ms. Samar Farhat. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah. I think, Samar, we can start with the second session.
Yes,
And,
yes, sure. Thank you.
Please, everyone, keep your questions for the second round.
Thank you, Farah and Suha, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Samar Farhat, and I'm very excited to be moderating our second and last roundtable for today, and the last part within the series of lectures titled Housing Uncertainties, Financial Crisis, and Social Protection. Introducing myself, I'm the HLP, Housing, Land and Property and Urban Recovery Advisor for Habitat for Humanity in Lebanon. I joined Habitat in their response to the Beirut blast and worked closely with vulnerable communities to identify priority needs, design quick impact projects through participatory approaches, along with facilitating dialogues on housing and producing materials and raising awareness on HLP. I hold a master's in urban planning and policies from the American University of Beirut, a diploma in urban engineering for sustainable cities from Lebanon, and a BA in architecture from Beirut Arab University. So during the past 3 decades, international organizations adopted frameworks of social protection, especially within countries facing financial meltdown. Social protection schemes were introduced as emergency interventions, reducing stresses from shocks and crises on affected individuals and families. Social protection schemes hardly account for housing in spite of the critical role played by adequate shelters and long-term well-being. An additional concern exists towards the most destitute, with increasingly indebted and impoverished middle classes. Important potential worth being explored within social protection schemes at times of crises as an investment of human capital and not only socio-economic benefits, especially when social protection is state-led and right-based. Focusing on the Arab MENA region, with societies characterized by severe inequalities and exposed to authoritarian models of governance, along with violence and increased impoverishment, the social protection expenditure is very low and limited mainly to cash transfer, food, and fee waivers. The Arab Spring, however, couldn't affect the landscape of social assistance with subsidies in cash social assistance, poverty targeting, and employment-based insurance increase. Moreover, housing barely appears in social protection schemes, although Arab governments in this region have liberal land markets and use housing as attraction to foreign capital. We started with the first roundtable on housing and social protection in the Arab region with discussion from the lens of social protection experts, while within our second roundtable, and by bringing together housing practitioners from both the public sector in both Lebanon and Egypt, and NGOs and UN agencies from both countries, we seek to provoke the mentioned challenges intensified by financial crises. We will try to keep a section on Q&A towards the end of this roundtable. So please feel free to type your question in the chat box, or you can raise it by then. So our first speaker for this roundtable is Mr. Roni Lahoud, the Chairman and General Director of the Public Corporation for Housing in Lebanon. Mr. Roni consults on planning, housing, engineering, and finance, and he is a qualified engineer, and he graduated from the Faculty of Engineering of the Lebanese University. Prior to joining the public sector, he has acted as head of the Middle East division of a consulting firm in the banking sector in the Middle East. In 2014, he was appointed by the Lebanese government as chairman and general director of the Public Corporation for Housing. Mr. Roni has served as a member of the Supreme Council of the General Directorate of Urban Planning since 2014 and as a member of the board of directors of the Central Fund for Internally Displaced Persons since 2014. He has since represented Lebanon in a series of conferences and meetings of Arab housing ministers. So in previous discussions with you, Mr. Roni, you have mentioned the huge number of people closing their loans. And for the people who are not familiar with the Lebanese context, the devaluation of the Lebanese pound has rendered loans taken in LBP almost valueless, which means that many people have been rushing to close their loans. We have had the chance to talk to you earlier about this issue. Can you please explain briefly the pattern and share some of the recent numbers, such as how many loans are closed and how many are still open and how many are actually defaulting? Also, how is PCH dealing during the crisis with households that default on loans, and can PCH support them and protect them so they won't lose their homes? One more thing concerning the loans closed, we suppose that PCH now has an oversupply of money in LBP. Is there any plan to invest it and any strategies to deal with this oversupply? And last but not least, you have been working lately on a draft for a housing policy with other entities engaged in the housing topic. Can you please talk a bit about how social protection is tackled or ensured within this policy, and what about the barriers or chances in implementing this policy? Mr. Roni, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, how are you? In fact, first of all, thanks a lot for your efforts, and special thanks also for Mona and the team, because they are and a continuous help, in fact, for me personally and for the PCH and for the Lebanese citizens. Just to start, in fact, I'll start with a quick presentation about, in fact, the PCH, the Public Corporation for Housing. In fact, the Public Corporation for Housing was established in 1996 and replaced the National Construction Division, the Council for Housing, the National Federation Union for Cooperative Lending, and the Independent Fund for Housing, and as well the Ministry of Planning and Ministry of Housing. So for me, it's better to have the Ministry of Housing and Planning in the future. Our mission is to facilitate Lebanese citizen access to housing and the rights. This is what we should discuss about it, the rights of the citizen to adequate housing. Now, previously, in fact, the PCH was giving loans to build, renovate, or expand their existing properties. And 95% it was to purchase and own an apartment. For sure, the criteria was to be sure that the loans were given for the mid and low income. Now, in fact, just to discuss about numbers and facts, 60% of the subsidized loans were assured via the PCH. The PCH gave almost 83,000 loans since 1999 till 2018. And it was dispatched over 30 banks. The PCH provided a model for the necessary cooperation between the public and the private sector. Now, if we go to your questions, in fact, the PCH were or help to have 3 laws were voted and published during the crisis to postpone the payments to protect the household and avoid citizens losing their homes. We know that the devaluation of the Lebanese pound has rendered the loans taken in LBP in Lebanese pound almost valueless, which means that many people, in fact, have been rushing to close their loans because at the same time they are afraid if we have the possibility to move it to the US dollar, but it's not the case, but the Lebanese people are a little bit afraid. And now if we want to give you the current status of the loans, since 1999, 97,000 applicants, 83,000 loans were given via the PCH. Till now, since 2020 till now, in fact, more than 13,600 were already closed, and we have in progress or in the PCH under closing more than 22,000. And we have also in the waiting list on the platform, which is called Minassa, more than 11,400 that they need to close. They already applied, in fact, to close their loans. And still open, in fact, we can say, or still active, we have almost 33,000 loans. Now, if we want to discuss about the defaulting, we don't have a lot of defaulting because most of the people, they afford to pay, in fact, their loans. Before the crisis, it was like $1,000 per month. Now it's about, we are talking about $10 to $15, which is nothing. They afford to pay it. It's this is why we don't have a lot of defaulting. It's a really small numbers because they don't want to pay. It's not they cannot afford to pay, which was the case before the crisis. Because before the crisis we have almost like 1% of defaulting. Now, given how many loans are closed, the PCH now has an oversupply of money in Lebanese pound. We are talking about more than 600 billions deposit at the banks, and most of it it's at the central bank. But we cannot give loans, in fact, for the moment, because even if we want to give 1 billion Lebanese pound, it's almost $10,000 US dollars, which is impossible to find or to get an apartment, or anyone will buy an apartment at this price. Now to go to the second part, in fact, I want just to give you a quick idea about the first housing policy or a high level of this housing policy that we already write in 2018, but till now it's not yet voted at the government, which is just to give you an idea about the first part, and then we will go to the thematic. First of all, we should coordinate, in fact, the process of decision-making to avoid overlapping responsibilities and conflict of powers, unify standards, work plans, assistance and benefits, review and update all relevant legislation to the sector, develop and approach to reorganize slums area in coordination with the General Directorate of Urbanism and the municipalities and the NGOs. And now, in fact, I'll go as well to discuss, to talk about the thematic. We have more than 30 ideas, but I'll try to give you a quick idea about some of it. First of all, for sure, we will stay giving subsidized loans, but in a small part or numbers per year, because before the crisis, it was like almost 5,000 per year, 5,000 loans per year. Second point, it's the rent with option to buy, which is leasing. The law issued in 2006, but still needs a lot of amendments because we don't have any opportunity, in fact, for the developers to go for it. Third point, it's the rent. And here we should define, in fact, the standards of what constitute an adequate housing, determine the ceiling for rent according to the apartment's conditions and its location, define an adequate yearly index. Fourth point, it's related to the old rental law. And here, most probably, we'll have a lot of problems in 2024. So end of next year, if we don't solve the problems related to the new law. Because, and it will be a lot of, so we'll have a lot of, or big, not a lot, big social problems, in fact. Next, as a fifth point, in fact, allow the public corporation for housing to expropriate lots where it can build housing units in partnership with the private sector. And it's the second or third time that I mentioned the private sector, because as public sector, we cannot afford to maintain, in fact, even if we construct housing, the maintenance, it will be much more difficult, and the citizen will pay the first year or maybe the first months, and then they will stop paying because it's related directly to the public sector. Six thematic, it's build the housing units in partnership with the municipalities under the PPP law, and for sure the private sector. Seventh, have the public corporation for housing acquire housing units in all the Lebanese region at a lower price. So for the moment, we can get it like at 40% of the market rate in order to lease them directly or through the corporating companies. Eighth, that we will introduce, in fact, the vente en viager or life estate option in Lebanon that exists for the moment in most of the European cities. Ninth, allocate a percentage of new building as affordable units sold at cost. And here it will be also a big challenge, in fact, to get this law at the parliament, because here we are getting like many apartments or units at the price cost, in fact, from the developers. Then we should adopt a new method in building techniques. Here we are talking about moving from concrete to light buildings to reduce construction costs in cooperation with the Order of Engineers and Architects.
Mr. Roni, if
yes,
we can conclude in 2 more minutes. Okay, thank you.
No, less than that. Introducing a new urban parks following international standards for green spaces within the cities. And last, for the moment, it's foster rural development and limit migration to the cities. The last point here, we should, in fact, for the moment, as short term, renovating the area affected by the blast of Beirut, where we need to protect the social fabric, economical, cultural, sectarian, and historical urban characters in neighborhood. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Roni, for all this info. I know you mentioned building new housing units as to provide an additional stock for adequate housing. Also, I need to just highlight, since we are working with BUL and with the increasing interest, and also providing this additional stock through the rehabilitation of existing housing units to be able to provide more supply within the stock. Thank you a lot. And
just to mention one more point. In fact, most of these points are not under the responsibility of the PCH for the moment. This is why we need to have a new laws.
Yes, hopefully we will have support from the political side and to be able to have this policy see the light soon. I need to call upon Mrs. May Abdel Hamid. I'm not sure if she was able to join. Mrs. May, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm online with you. Yeah, I just joined.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Happy to be with you this afternoon, and happy Eid to all. I'm all yours. Happy to share some thoughts on our Egyptian experience as well, and and get questions from the floor and get insights from the others participating in the dialogue.
Thank you, Mrs. May. So to introduce Mrs. May Abdelhamid, she's the Chief Executive Officer of Social Housing and Mortgage Finance Fund in Egypt. Since November 2019, Mrs. May has served as a member of the Board of Directors of the African Union for Housing Finance and became the first female deputy chairman of AUHF in 2020. Mrs. May is an expert in corporate and mortgage lending with over 26 years of professional experience. She was an advisor to the chairman of the Egyptian Housing Finance Company, a board member of SAIB Bank, and served as the vice chairman of the Egyptian Mortgage Refinance Company. She was a board member of the Housing and Development Bank, the Egyptian Liquidity Facility, and private institutions, including Tamir on securitization and October on development and real estate. So Mrs. May, can you please describe briefly the context of the mortgage in Egypt and how they have been affected by the ongoing devaluation, and what's happening to the household who cannot pay the loans? Also, if you, what do you consider the gaps and major challenges facing securing social protection for the most impoverished? And what about the role of the public sector in terms of social protection in Egypt? And what were the policies and strategies taken to overcome the challenges mentioned? It would be appreciated if we can keep it up to 10 minutes as to be able to cover and introduce the whole speaker. Thank you, Mrs. May, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. We'll try to be as brief as possible, maybe less. So let's start with the challenges that are more or less, I consider the challenges universal everywhere, and especially in our region. So our main challenges facing the social housing context in general was the supply shortages. So securing land and low availability of affordable housing units was definitely something that we were facing at the start. We all live on the valley and the Delta region, so 7% of the population lives there, while the rest of Egypt is desert land that needs development and infrastructure. The overcrowdedness leads definitely to the high house prices that affects also the affordability of people. We have a population, definitely everyone knows that we have a population that exceeds the 100 million, 105, and 2% increase in population size every year. We have new marriages every year that are around 500,000 new marriages. We have definitely, this is a very challenging thing to try to supply the market with the units needed to only capture. We have like more than 1 million marriages every year. So the housing demand every year is estimated at 500,000. And also with the macro challenges of the inflation and the double-digit interest rate environment, this also affected the affordability. What we as policy direction adopted in Egypt since 2014 is that we came up with an initiative to solve the supply shortages and to make the houses affordable for Egyptians by creating a program which is called the Housing for All Egyptians. And this was an initiative that was launched together with establishing the fund that I am honored to be managing since 2014. And as a response of these problems, we have negotiated with the central banks and the banking sector, and also with policymakers, to come up with a program that highly depend on mortgages for making the houses affordable, and to make a program sustainable, so that we get reimbursed of the funds we invest in building houses, and then use the mortgage proceeds to rebuild and have a sustainable program. We have come up with a program that is that bridges the affordability gaps using subsidies. But by using subsidies, we try to have a smart subsidy system whereby we pay the subsidy depending on the income level. So the targeting is based on income levels we set, and that we review periodically based on the macro environment and the inflation and so on. And the higher the income, the less subsidy you get. We get a down payment from beneficiaries. We pay a down payment subsidy that is deducted from the unit value, and the beneficiary gets a mortgage rate, a mortgage linked subsidized loan from the banking sector. Definitely, this had a lot of challenges that we needed to work on. It's a very detailed and comprehensive process, because at the time of the start, we didn't have a mortgage system, or we had like a nascent mortgage system that was like a very small in size, given the challenges related to property registration, and also the issues related to inclusion, especially that we are addressing the low-income target group that has never been bankable or never used to have loans from banks. So we started the policy dialogues maybe early on in 2011 or 12 after the Arab Spring. And by 2014, we had the dialogues finalized, and we had like a policy, and we launched the program with an initiative from the central bank to offer 20 billion Egyptian pounds in loans at a subsidized rate of 5% and 7%. And this was very low compared to the market rates at the time, which were around the 14 or 15%. And we also managed to obtain a World Bank loan for 500 million at the time, which was later on increased with the program going well and reaching beneficiaries. So the World Bank loan, we use the funds to pay the cash subsidy for the targeted beneficiaries. We managed to obtain. We as an entity, we are part of the Ministry of Housing, so we have other entities that own all the desert land that are that we plan to develop to increase the urban areas to 14% of Egypt land. So most of the program is built on new communities built by the new urban communities authorities that is under the Ministry of Housing. We basically get the land for free from this entity, and we sell the flats at the construction cost. We do not make any profits out of that, and we do not include the cost of the land inside the program. And ever since, at the start, we definitely didn't have a lot of positive appetite from the banking sector because of the reasons I mentioned earlier. We tried to put a lot of incentives in the program so that as to encourage the banks and the mortgage finance companies to come in. So at the start, we had managed to fill all the gaps related to registering the mortgage and giving all the confidence to the banks that in cases of default, they will be able to do the foreclosure process and so on. But above that, also we allowed them a margin of 4.5% fixed over the 20 years loan, and that was like a very rich subsidy for 20 years. We started with the 3 or 4 public banks at the beginning, but with the program going on and the very low default rates, other banks, private and the mortgage finance companies started to come in and were very much encouraged by the incentives we provided. It was a long journey, definitely. By now we have like 31 banks and mortgage companies. We reduced the incentives to 2% only for the 20 years. And even though the banks are still encouraged to do that, because the experience with the banks through the past 10 years is that the quality of the loan portfolio is really very good, since we have a cash subsidy that is deducted from the unit value we also get a 15% down payment from beneficiaries, so the loan to value is around 65%. So a very reasonable loan to value, and also with the inflation rate, the banks their collateral value has increased very much in value. So the default rate so far since 2014 till date is less than 1%, which is encouraging banks to come more and more. Maybe the inflation will impact our ability to build houses at the same conditions, at the same levels of subsidies, because subsidies became a bit more expensive with the increases in interest rates. Especially last year, we had an increase of 10% in interest rates. So that's challenging, because the interest differential we are paying between the market rate and the loan at the rates we are offering to our beneficiaries is widening, and as a gap, it's costing the treasury a lot. But the program has proved that it is very important for social protection and for creating a value investment and wealth for low-income people, and it's one of the most popular programs in Egypt. So far, our numbers from 2014 till date, maybe the first year we had like 400 beneficiaries. Now we book more than 10,000 beneficiaries per month. So a total of 510,000 units delivered in those 8 years. Number of banks, as I said, increased from 31 banks to from 4 banks to 31 banks and mortgage companies. The value of the market has jumped to 60 billion. We have booked 60 billion Egyptian pounds in loan, and we have paid around 9 billion Egyptian pounds out of the proceeds of the World Bank loan as cash subsidies to the beneficiaries. We have worked with contractors to secure the loans, but the financing come from us, the fund. We work as master developer. We put the financing and we paid the private contractors to build. We had like 25 contractors in 2014, and by now we have maybe around 500 private contractors that work with us, and we created a lot of jobs in this context. And contractors provide very competitive pricing for the units they are building, because they get their money on time, given we are our cash we have a machine that is producing cash every month through selling the units through the mortgage system. The first seed capital was through some units built by financed by the treasury, and some grants from other Arab countries during the Arab Spring, but this created a seed capital that we are reinvesting and getting the funds through the mortgage system. So we have a sustainable program. This is in brief what we have achieved so far. It has definitely helped a lot in generating employment, as I said, and in increasing GDP. It had a lot of contribution to GDP. It also helped environmentally to rationalize water and electricity consumption, less growth in slum and creation of slums. We've moved also to a green initiative lately, so we are trying to using eco-friendly material. We're building
Mrs. Mai, if we can wrap up in 1 minute, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm closing. And socially, we have managed to enable women household also to get access to units. So 23% of our beneficiaries are women, and we also allow people with special needs a special allocation of 5%. And so far, they managed to obtain their flats. We also included the marginalized groups like informal income and so on. So our beneficiaries, 20% of them are people of informal income. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer anything.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Mai. Of course, we will have towards the end a section on Q&A. And thank you for the overview and all the information and the interesting number you provided us. Now also joining us from Egypt, Dr. Salma Yusfi, the Urban Development Program Manager in Riot UN Habitat Egypt. Salma is an Egyptian architect and urban planner. She has worked at the UN as governance and legislation officer, then program officer for housing and urban development. Recently, she has worked closely with partners to enable innovative impact at both policy and implementation levels. She supported the publication of Egypt's first right-based national housing strategy, the new participatory urban upgrading and development approach, and innovative mechanisms that have provided clean drinking water to more than 2 million people in priority areas in Egypt. Salma holds a PhD in urban development from Ain Shams University, Egypt, and a postgraduate diploma in housing and land management from the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies, Rotterdam, Netherlands. Dr. Salma, we know that UN Habitat targets policies to support housing for the most vulnerable groups. Who are these most vulnerable in your context, and how do you see social protection employed to support them? Also, if you can talk, or is there anything in your work on social protection, and how is this related to housing? And can you give us a specific example of how UN Habitat has deployed a social protection scheme that might have had an impact on housing? If you can reply to a question from the previous panel on the case of Egypt and addressing unsafe areas in Tangle and the role of organization in their attempt for slum upgrading, considered associated with the shift in policies and providing justification for demolition of buildings under the pretext of upgrading. If you can elaborate and talk us a bit about the national net for unsafe areas within your context. The floor is yours, Dr. Salma.
Thank you so much, Samar, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to this very, very interesting discussion. We've heard a lot of interesting dialogue since the morning, so I'm very happy and honored to be part of this dialogue. I prepared a very quick presentation while my colleagues talked, and I just thought it might be visually easy to walk you through responses to some of the issues that were raised by colleagues. So, of course, housing will remain at the center of the development agenda. And I think that, you know, the relationship between housing and development has become very evident also during COVID, but it has always been. And we've always seen housing in our program as part of the core issues that can really stimulate economy, reduce poverty, promote inclusion, and it really has the biggest effect on urban development and on welfare and human development in general. So in Egypt, we work under a number of frameworks, be it international frameworks like, you know, the global declarations, the SDGs, the new urban agenda, but we also have the newly endorsed national urban policy, the new strategic plan for urban development, Egypt Vision 2030, and also the constitution, the new one in 2014. So of course, UN Habitat has extensive experience in housing field, and we've helped more than 100 national and local governments on their housing profiles. And I'll skip to the core of the introduction of what we do in Egypt. So basically, what happened in Egypt maybe since 2015 is that we really had this dream to employ our twin-track approach of UN Habitat in Egypt, and that being looking at the housing provision and the new provision of housing, but also the upgrading and undertaking different upgrading schemes. And this will bring me to also answering the comment raised before. So we've worked on the regional program, but also the national program on urban upgrading, and we've worked on the national housing policy and profile. And the first real step that was published in 2017 was the National Housing Profile, and it was a really a very important step in you know, endorsing the global housing strategy that was issued in 2015 by UN Habitat, and Egypt really took the leadership in you know, implementing this global process through preparing the National Housing Profile. And why was it very important? Because it really set our expectations and our understanding of the sector through numbers, you know. So what are the priorities? What are the key issues? What is the affordability gaps? How can we really tackle the real people in need. And this is my first comment in relationship to social protection and addressing the real needs and not the market needs of the housing. And that was one of the very important things that, you know, despite the various trials to target the real, you know, the real needed target groups in housing programs, there still was a gap, and there still was a need for re-looking into the housing provision, be it a public, private, or even informal production. So based on the profile, the strategy was formulated, and because the profile really put key issues in perspective, the housing policy in Egypt looked at four main pillars. So the first pillar relates to social protection. The first one addresses the low-income housing, and really that was the main focus and the key gap that was there that needed to be addressed. How can we have housing policies that supports low-income housing? And that was, as Dr. May thankfully said, through first looking into public land for housing and how can you avail accessible in-city affordable land for housing, and then subsidized rent. And this is one of the very important things that we're now looking into in cooperation with Dr. May and the fund. How can we focus on also subsidized rent to really reach the target groups that cannot afford even the highly subsidized ownership units? And then one of the important pillars was also formulated in cooperation with the Ministry of Social Solidarity is how can we really have the relief programs through subsidizing people and not housing, because we don't want to mess up the market, but we really want to reach out to the most needy. So how can we have the program supporting people, but not the housing units themselves? And again, there were also issues relating to relief standards for affordable housing. So we need to learn also from the success stories of informal settlements, which were in some ways a little bit efficient, of course, with having the safety aspect in mind, but we need to also see and look out and see how can we have housing standards that are a little bit flexible to also be able to be more affordable. And then, of course, what we've listened to in the previous section, financing affordable housing, and that this is a very big issue. So that was one of the main focuses of the housing policies. And then we had policies addressing existing stocks and vacant units, because this will also reach us to affordability and how can we make use of this available stock. This also included issues relating to management, regulatory, tenure issues, and all of these things. And then housing policies addressing urban development areas. And I will come to this for a while, because this was the key birth of the new urban upgrading approach, which is the second phase of what was mentioned in the previous session, which is the addressing the unsafe areas. And then finally, housing policies, the achieving residential areas goals and sustainable housing. And I was very also happy to hear previous colleagues in the previous session talk about housing as sustainable communities, and not only housing units, but also services, access to services and living communities. So what we did is that we really tried to do this integration between the existing stock and the upgrading and what we do in terms of the existing areas and then the new housing provision, and how can we support the government to have more sustainable new housing provision. So in terms of urban upgrading, and very quickly, what happened is that we had this shift from targeting specific areas, which were unsafe areas in the previous program, to the citywide urban upgrading approach. And the key issue is that instead of looking at the challenge, we wanted to look at the whole city and see where are the potentials and where are these areas suited in the middle of the city. So in many cases, urban upgrading would only need that you open up access to better areas or a higher level area, so that economic and local value chains happen more frequently. So looking at only the problem or only the informal settlement would not avail this integration between the different parts of the city. So what we did is that we really tried to look into how to have a blended finance mechanism, a multi-finance mechanism, so that we were not only looking at informal settlements, but we're also looking at investment opportunities in the city and how can we do the cross-financing between both. And this was, of course, in very close cooperation with the City Investment Facility of UN Habitat, SDG Cities program, to really see how can we advance SDGs through these upgrading programs. In the first phase of the program, we were very happy that, based on this studies, the name of the Informal Settlement Development Fund in Egypt was changed. So instead of being the Informal Settlement Development Fund, it's now the Urban Upgrading Fund with a more wide mandate, a more comprehensive mandate for development and not only upgrading of specific informal settlements. The new approach and the new methodology is now part of the city planning tools and TORs in Egypt. It's part of the new law that is being endorsed. So the new law is talking about urban upgrading areas and not unsafe areas, not informal areas or unplanned areas, which also takes into consideration how can this upgrading brings people back to the center, because we want a citywide approach that benefits everybody, not specific groups. And of course, there was a number of capacity building and other sorts of issues, but I want to be very quick. My last slide is on the way forward, which also links to what we want to do also to build on what happened already. So the first thing is our very promising cooperation with the Social Fund, Social Housing and Mortgage Finance Fund, Maya Abdel Hamid, working on the rental housing units. And as I said, a big part of our affordability gaps is because the main focus has been for so many years on ownership schemes. What we want to do now is really look into the rental housing market in Egypt and see how can we utilize the existing potential of this market to promote its growth and avail adequate housing for all. And by adequate, we mean attractive, formal, maintained, affordable, reflects the real market, the real needs and the market needs, but also responds to the housing gap. So that is on the provision side. On our other track side, on upgrading, now we have the first part of the process completed. What we're doing now is that we're supporting the fund, the Urban Development Fund, to identify and develop priority urban upgrading development interventions, which would accelerate SDGs, include vulnerable groups, and make sure that, you know, these priority areas are the most priority to the people in the cities. Of course, we're aligning to the SDGs and New Urban Agenda, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salma, for this overview. And also with UN Habitat, but back to Lebanon, our next speaker is Dr. Nanor Karagosian, the Urban Analysis and Policy Unit Manager at UN Habitat Lebanon. Nanor manages multiple urban researches at city and neighborhood profiling and policy projects related to housing and transport, which also have capacity building, knowledge exchange, and advocacy components. Before joining UN Habitat, Nanor was an assistant professor and the Armenian Studies Department Director at Haigazian University, Lebanon. She has also undertaken social science research consultancies on refugee diaspora issues, such as for the Right for Time project and the Armenian Diaspora Survey project. Previously, Nanor worked as senior web content editor at the Lebanese American University's Marketing and Communication Department and as graduate research assistant at the American University of Beirut's Political Studies and Public Administration Department. Nanor holds a DPhil in International Development from the University of Oxford and an MA in Public Administration from AUB and a BA in Business Administration from Haigazian University. Dr. Nanor within UN Habitat Lebanon's work on pressing urban needs and urban policy reform priorities. Can we unpack the social protection within these policies with a focus on housing? And how can public policy reform help provide housing and social protection in the Lebanese context, considering that most people describe it as a failed state? Also, what are some of the main opportunities that can help advance on some of these policy reform priorities? Dr. Nanor, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be part of this roundtable discussion today, which has been very interesting. In my answer, I might focus on one or two parts of your question a bit more than the rest because of time limitations, obviously. I will specifically focus on two threads of work that UN Habitat in Lebanon has been focusing on in the past few years, related to urban policy at large, with a focus on housing that is relevant to our discussion today, meaning it is directly or indirectly related to social protection. One has to do with the national urban policies program, which is something my colleague Salma mentioned, is a regional program that UN Habitat, it's a global program actually, and in the region UN Habitat has also been implementing it. So as part of that regional program in Lebanon, we initiated it, we helped initiate it in 2017. As part of that NUP program, National Urban Policy, we published a diagnosis report in 2018, and then subsequently we identified 2 priority sectors to focus on, and we tried to come up with policy guides on how we can mainstream these sectors into a future national urban policy in Lebanon. So these 2 sectors, one of them was housing, the other one was transport mobility. And we also published actually a synthesis report to look at the interlinkages because of that integrated approach that we always look at, as Salma also mentioned. So these publications, and this is, I will focus on one of them, the National Urban Policy Housing Guide, which I will also share the link in the chat soon. I will focus on it and on some of the recommendations that we've included in it that are, as I said, related to directly or indirectly to social protection shortly. But I also want to mention a more recent thread of work or strand of work, which is directly interlinked to the NUP program. Actually, it's part of the Lebanon Reform, Recovery and Reconstruction Framework, the 3RF. For those who are familiar with the Lebanon context, this is a framework. It's a partnership between the UN, the World Bank, the EU, the government, civil society, donors, international organizations, that was created or was launched in December 2020 as a response to the Beirut port blast. And the initial focus was on Beirut port blast affected area recovery. But after this initial track, and since April 2023, there was a co-chair statement, and I can also share in the chat shortly, saying that we want to move to the 3RF to become a platform for inclusive policy dialogue. So we're moving from a recovery track to a more policy reform track, which is at a national level. It's no longer limited geographically to the port blast affected areas. So as part of this redefined framework, 3RF framework, there was an urban policy working group created, which we are now very recently, if we're talking about the last few months, that we are now as UN Habitat leading. The World Bank is co-leading. And as part of these efforts, we have been holding bilateral and group consultations with different stakeholders on to identify pressing urban challenges and policy priorities in the country, including on housing, including linked to social protection. So what I'll present next is some of these policy recommendations that we have included or we have published as part of the housing guide that I mentioned from our NUP program, that have also been raised or are being discussed now in these different consultations that we've been having and under the 3RF Urban Policy Working Group. The most recent one actually was on Friday, and some of you attended, like somewhat yourself and Muna Fawaz and others. But before I present some of these, policy recommendations that we have that have been mentioned or are published in the report, I just want to frame them. I just want to frame to put a frame to them by presenting some of the general principles and values that we have listed in the report, and they might sound simple or familiar, to the people that have been participating in these discussions, but I think it is important to list them in order for you to understand where these policy recommendations are coming from. So one is, of course, in terms of principle, to consider housing as a human right, not a commodity or financial asset. The other is that policies should prioritize the use and social value over the exchange value of land and housing. Third is public interest should be prioritized over private interests. Housing strategies should be people-oriented. Housing policy should regulate the market and serve all societal segments, including vulnerable groups. And the focus should be on providing a variety of housing tenures, not only private individual ownership, to facilitate upward mobility and residential mobility. So within this frame, of policy values and principles, some of the recommendations that we have put forward in the guide and we have been discussing that are, as I said, linked directly or indirectly to social protection are as follows. And I'll just list very briefly some of them without going into detail because we don't have time, I know. So one has to do with creating capacity building programs on affordable housing production for municipalities and unions of municipalities in Lebanon. Another recommendation is to provide financial assistance to low and moderate income individuals and families, both tenants and homeowners, for home extension, maintenance, rehabilitation, energy efficiency, and so on. And this could take the different forms, either dedicated vouchers or subsidized microloans and so on. Another recommendation, and I'm reading it quickly just so I know we don't have a lot of time, is to create social home ownership programs to allow members of lower income communities to acquire a home. And again, in the guide, we have listed a number of policy tools through which this can be done. Another recommendation is to create an assistance fund for distressed homeowners associations in order to stabilize them and avoid failures that would contribute to accelerated impoverishment of homeowners and therefore also gradual deterioration of residential buildings. Another big batch of recommendations has to do with reconfiguring and clarifying landlord-tenant relationships. Here comes security of tenure issues and legislation and procedures and arbitration procedures, collaborative dispute resolution mechanisms, and so on. Another recommendation is, of course, this has been mentioned several times, social rental housing. The recommendation is to design a Lebanese prototype for that by experimenting in carefully chosen locations and involving municipalities and unions of municipalities. So really going at the local level as well as local employers and the community groups. And through these trials or experiments, these should lead to the implementation of a wider social rental housing strategy for the medium and short and long terms. There are other recommendations regarding innovative housing finance to facilitate the production of or access to affordable housing. The establishment of intermunicipal public lands, to allow to allow these banks to buy land at a lower rate, at under the market rate, and therefore to provide reasonably priced land for different projects, including affordable housing. Also to establish an inclusive housing innovation fund, but also capacity development programs for first-time homeowners, actually to familiarize them with their rights and duties. Then we have a couple of recommendations related to urban regeneration strategies for deteriorated urban areas and informal areas, following an area-based approach that we as UN Habitat have been really pushing forward along with several other stakeholders in the past few years, and we have done some projects actually in terms of urban upgrading, multi-sectoral urban upgrading in several disadvantaged neighborhoods. So these are some of the policy recommendations that we have, as I said, mentioned in this guide, or that are now being discussed in the 3RF urban policy working group consultations. Now, what opportunities exist? What are the issues? And maybe I'll focus a bit on the opportunities very briefly, and I'm closing. Yes. So one, I think we can, this new direction of the 3RF, I think, is an opportunity And the fact that different stakeholders have started coming together and hopefully will continue to do so, to have this inclusive dialogue and identify certain policy priorities that are within reach, noting the multitude of difficulties we have, the challenges that we are facing. We need to identify really entry points, strategic entry points for us. So this forum of the 3RF could be an opportunity that we could capitalize on, to build on the momentum, and it could strengthen joint advocacy. We can work together basically to advocate for these priorities that we will jointly identify. Also, another opportunity is to really rely on existing work that has been done by all of us, not only UN Habitat, but also others here, in the form of, for example, data generation or normative work like the NUP, guides that I mentioned. UN Habitat, we've done neighborhood profiles of disadvantaged neighborhoods. We have collected data on these, so we know some of the housing difficulties there, some of the housing challenges. BUL has done, the platform on precarious lives, housing uncertainties, and others, also are working on that. So we can capitalize on these, even though they have been disjointed efforts. We can try to kind of coordinate somehow. The existence of active civil society organizations and universities could help us. So these are opportunities that we can build on. Also lessons learned from previous years and really diagnosing these and really understanding them. And this is something that we've tried to do in this guide, a diagnosis of the housing situation, whether the post-civil war reconstruction or the Beirut port housing rehabilitation projects or the social housing projects that have been undertaken by different municipalities here and there in Lebanon. So these are all things that we can, that are lessons learned, that we can derive lessons from to build on some of these priorities that we have been discussing. So I'll end here, and thank you so much, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have, noting that I'm not a housing expert, but I'm more in the management side, the coordination side of the projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nanor, and thank you for all the effort you are doing, and hopefully it will be translated to reality. Now, last but not least, we have Mr. Fouad Bijani, the Shelter and Wash Project Manager at the Norwegian Refugee Council, Lebanon. Fouad leads the shelter and wash programs in Beirut and Mount Lebanon. He holds a BA in civil engineering and a master's in construction management from Concordia University, Montreal. He also studied affordable housing at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Before joining NRC, Fouad led the shelter emergency and recovery responses for the Beirut blast at Madar. He has extensive experience working with international donors and providing humanitarian shelter assistance in hard-to-reach areas. Fouad's work focuses on participatory approaches and sustainable shelter solution, in particular affordable housing. Fouad, as NRC co-leads the shelter sector in Lebanon, how would you assess and describe the impact of the financial crisis in Lebanon on the shelter and housing sectors, and consequently on social protection? Also, if you can talk to us of how are humanitarian actors like NRC contributing to social protection through their shelter programs and intervention in Lebanon? And would you be able to speak a bit on the impact of collaboration between various actors on social protection? The floor is yours, Fouad.
Thank you, Samar, so much for the question. First, I would like to take this opportunity to express how delighted I am personally to take part of this interesting roundtable. And overall, on behalf of NRC, it's been an excellent series of discussion during the month of June with an outstanding lineup. I would like to thank our co-organizers, Habitat for Humanity, UN Habitat, the Beirut Urban Lab at AUB, and of course, all the participants and audience. And thank you for your patience today. So to start, to answer your complex question within a short time, but it's really important question, I'll try to structure my answer into two parts. I will describe the current situation and the impact of the financial crisis on the housing sector in Lebanon, especially from the lenses of an international humanitarian organization like NRC that adopts a human rights approach when it comes to access to adequate housing. Then I'll cover NRC quickly, shelter implementation within the Lebanese context, and also means of collaboration with key stakeholders. So I'll try to build my answer on what's been shared previously throughout the series. So again, I won't go through the Lebanese financial crisis context as it's been covered extensively before, devaluation of the lira, impacting income, purchasing power, and putting vulnerable population from both host and refugees community at risk. So I remember last Tuesday, I liked a lot Leila Ferhani's approach, and which is a global approach. I think we can all agree that the housing sector in general globally is largely driven by three elements: affordability, security of tenure, and habitability. So I will dissect each element when it comes to the Lebanese context within this financial crisis. So I'll start with affordability. So as NRC, with our field frontliners and our daily work, we witnessed large struggles when it comes to our participant beneficiaries to pay their rent. This crisis has really impacted the affordability of access to shelters. So we have we've seen 83% of our participants having the rent fees exhausting more than 60% of their income. At the household level, this is a very critical percentage, because in these particular cases, it's when vulnerable families start jeopardizing essentials like food, health, clothing, education. You will see more school dropouts, child labor, protection concerns. And also what we've witnessed through our community helpline in 2022, across Lebanon, we've received 33,000 requests of support in cash for rent. And this quarter alone, 2023, we had 12,500 requests. And it's important to note we see a massive increase in Lebanese and beneficiary reaching out to NRC for their support. So this, in terms of affordability, the crisis has really magnified the pre-existing struggles and challenges. And I'm particularly speaking of rental schemes. On the security of tenure, the volatility of the local currency, the volatility of the rental market, lack of regulation when it comes to rental market. According to UNHCR Wazir, 92% of Syrian refugees in Lebanon have verbal agreement. So you can all imagine this uncertainties, this gray area in agreement in the dynamics between an owner and the tenant. As many previous speakers have raised this, it always plays in favor of the owner, and it can lead to increase in the rent and eviction. But also important to note here, I remember an example given in Denver, where the focus was on large corporate that took benefit from that. But here in the Lebanese context, when we see in peri-urban and rural Lebanese area, property owner from the lower middle class who rely on rental collection as their primary source of income got more vulnerable, and it's kind of an understandable negative coping mechanism that we see every day. To go quickly, lastly, on habitability, of course, within this crisis, benefit or residents or property owners are enabled to upgrade their substandard or at least maintain it to meet the minimum standard. So all of these led to more and more severe crisis when it comes to housing. So if we look at these three drivers of the housing ecosystem, affordability, security of tenure, and habitability, all combined, we see really negative trends of eviction, higher rates of eviction, in particular in Beirut, where the demand-supply market is really high. We've seen internal mobility, a lot of relocation, families moving over and over, displacement, and accumulated debt, and in the most severe cases, homelessness, unfortunately. So all of these factors combined together have put in the most vulnerable communities, migrant workers, refugee Lebanese, at higher risk of protection concerns, and added up and created more social tension. Already there's a lot of tension between the host and refugee community, between refugee, host in Lebanon that we see on a daily basis, and adding to the owner-tenant friction and tension. So all of that really aggravated the situation. So when it comes to NRC or similar INGO shelter actors who are dealing with all these housing concerns in this very complex and difficult times and tense overall housing ecosystem. So I'll mention a bit parts of our programming, NRC shelter programming. We have mainly a shelter-based approach or area-based approach where we do upgrading of substandard shelter to meet minimum standard. This is a point where we address habitability. We select municipalities that are vulnerable, and we do our study in a multi-sectorial comprehensive approach. So, and we've seen that a lot. And when it comes to homeowner residing in their properties, this rehabilitation, this support and repair has improved the condition of their shelter. They feel safer, more comfortable, and more dignified. And then when it comes to tenant, we seek to have, when we do the upgrading of the shelter, we seek to have, like, to utilize the incentive from the owner-led to push for at least rent freeze. Before the crisis, we would push more for rent reduction, occupancy free of charge in unoccupied shelter. The other part of our programming that will address more security of tenure and affordability, and on the shorter term, of course, we're aware of that, in the urgent shorter term, is support of cash for rent. And we have plans for the longer term that I'll speak about in the end, of more sustainable solution through affordable housing and mainly through rental. For NRC CFR or cash for rent programming, it's protection centered. Really important to highlight this point. Its primary objective is not to address poverty solely, as INGO would do MPCA, which is a better solution, multi-purpose cash assistance, but it's mainly for protection cases. And with all this volume of requests, we sequence the assistance and prioritization happen. So the program is very protection-centered and protection-based. Ideally, we receive referrals from protection and case management agency for participant at imminent risk of eviction, GBV survivor, people with specific need, female-headed household, etc. And where the case management agency would follow with the participant, with the mental health component, and NRC would come in to contribute to the housing component. So when the case management agency deem it's the right and proper time to contribute. This is a short-term solution to address urgent need in this crisis. And yeah, ideally in a cash for rent program, shelter actors should seek to be more proactive and to support participants at potential risk of eviction to mitigate that. But due to the large need in Lebanon, unfortunately, in the crisis, we are mainly more reactive. Finally, to go quickly, and thank you for your patience, for more sustainable solutions and longer term solutions. So in the short term, imminent term, we rely on our cash for rent programming. For the longer and more sustainable solution when it comes to security of tenure, all of these components, NRC is exploring and strategizing the most efficient way to support inadequate affordable housing. We see a lot of interest from our donor, mainly KfW, to support us on this front. Of course, we are aware it's a collective effort where the government should lead, financial institution, academic, practitioner, and really important to mention the private sector. And we should all come together for innovative solution, experiment, and hopefully support on that front. We envision NRC role in that, mainly like Nanor mentioned also on lobbying, advocacy a lot, like the non-occupied property tax that can be a really game changer in Lebanon and an enabler. NRC added value and expertise on eligibility criteria, sequencing of assistance, and participatory approaches. And hopefully we can pilot at localities, scalable and replicable prototypes. And of course, also hosting similar event like this very excellent event we've had during the month of June, where practitioner, academics, all of us are brainstorming together, sharing experiences and looking for feasible solution. So that's it from my side quickly. Thank you, everyone. And back to you, Summer.
Thank you, Fuad, and thank you for all your efforts. Conscious of time, I need to check if we can extend for additional minutes for any questions from the audience. If you can raise your hand and ask your question, maybe we can have additional few more minutes. Sahar?
Yes, I think we can take 2 questions.
Okay.
And then end this.
So if anyone has any question for any of our 5 speakers, please just do so. I guess we have in the chat box one question about, can the housing issue be addressed in a comprehensive manner outside the umbrella real estate speculation background? That was one of the major drivers of the economic collapse in Lebanon, excluding alternative productive investments along decades through the exorbitant and uncontrolled benefits it guaranteed. I guess it's a question any of Lebanese colleagues would like to answer this question, since it's related to the Lebanese context. Also, Mona added, how can you do housing policy on one side and push the prices up on the other? Would any of the speakers would like to add to these comments?
I mean, just to mention that concerning the first question, in fact, for me, the collapse is not related to the speculation that happened on the market of the real estate. So I don't know what kind of speculations, because if we took, for example, the loans via the PCH, we are talking about 180,000, in fact. So it's not, we are not talking about billions or millions of dollars that was or used, in fact, to have the speculation that we are talking about. So for me, it's not related. The collapse, it's related to the corruption, to many other things that we are not here to talk about it, but it's not related to the speculation that happened on the real estate.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney. Would anyone else would like to add to this, or do we have any additional question? We can take one more question, or in case we don't have any, we can wrap up.
Maybe I can just comment briefly about the relationship between policies and markets, because I know that this can also be very confusing. I think that the challenge here is that in many of our economies, the investments are very much linked to the housing market. And this is not within the housing policy framework, it's within the national framework of investments. And I think that the more the countries at the national level try to de-link investments and provide other investment opportunities rather than investing in housing, the better the housing policies can be impactful. So indeed, I think that some of the, our efforts on housing policies can go in one direction, but it really needs to be complemented with other efforts to have other investment opportunities, because the more investment is linked to housing, the less the housing policies will be impactful. Back to you, Soha.
Thank you, Dr. Salma. So I guess if we don't have any additional question, we can wrap up as we come to the end of the session for today and the end of our second roundtable. The first one brought together social policy experts from the region, while the second one brought experts from the public sector, NGOs and UN agencies in both Egypt and Lebanon, and tackled the challenges faced and opportunities and way of dealing with them. Thank you all for your patience, for staying that long with us. And thank you for all speakers for accepting first the invitation and for joining us today in this roundtable and sharing your different experiences. Thank you for all the audience who joined us throughout the series during the month of June over 4 weeks. And again, for those who stayed till the end. I also want to thank BUL for inviting us, Habitat, to co-organize this series. And a big thanks to Mona, Soha, and Dina, and all colleagues from UN Habitat and NRC for all the effort done. And finally, I want to wish a blissful Adha for all those celebrating it. And I leave it to Mona to conclude the series. Mona, over to you.
Yes, hi everyone. I thought the plan was for Soha, but I can do it. I just really want to thank everyone for super valuable inputs, and throughout the month, but especially today, we have come full circle thinking about the social protections and their relation to housing. I should say that the team at the Beirut Urban Lab started thinking about social protection and housing about 2.5 or 3 years ago. And if Soha was concluding, she would do it better because she'd remember the exact date. We had a provocation to the Ford Foundation that wanted to shift its entire funding program to social protection by saying that actually we think that we should be thinking more structurally. And as a provocation, we said, how about housing? How do you do social protection in the way you define it and you do housing? And I think that throughout the research that was conducted first in the lab and then all these conversations with the partners who have done this and hearing the fantastic interventions over the month of June, we have really come to realize on the one hand that there are actually, especially from today's discussion, ways in which we could rethink how we approach social protection to include housing as a critical element. And on the other, that we should continue that conversation because we're really just still scratching the surface of a very critical challenge. But certainly the conversation has been very rich. So I want to join Samar in thanking everyone for today, but also for the whole month, and in wishing everyone Adha Mubarak. Thank you also for all the team that didn't talk and reached out and worked and organized everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Take good care.
Thank you, everyone.
you.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.